can upload. Excellent. Hello and welcome. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this Heading for Extinction talk. This is talk version 6.2, and it is Wednesday, the 12th of July, 2023. This is one of Extinction Rebellion's flagship talks. I have introduced myself, but I will do so very briefly again. My name is Bors. I am the editor of this talk, and I'm also one of the speakers who delivers this talk. We have had a little chat with the audience, and we are ready to go. So, well, what is this talk about? This talk is broadly about three things. Number one, the science. And we've realized over time that over multiple different iterations of this talk that we need to do less and less of the science. And that's because people are broadly aware now. And the people who show up to a talk like this are likely to be pretty clear on the existence of the climate emergency and the nature of it. So we've reduced over time the number of slides that deal with the climate and the ecological emergency, and we have increased the slides in the further sections. Overall, the slides, we used to have about 100 of them. We're down to 50. So the good news is it takes less time now to get through the whole thing. It's a whistle-stop tour of multiple different topics, and they all bear to be dug into in more detail. There is a document on the XR website called Emergency on Planet Earth. It's about 200 pages of fantastic background material assembled by XR scientists. And if you want more on the climate and ecological emergency, it's all there, it's referenced, it's indexed, it's great. I can only recommend it. All of the stuff that's in this talk, as well as in that document, is peer-reviewed, fact-checked, cross-referenced by scientists of XR, and we stand by the data and the facts that are in it. In fact, it's mostly very mainstream science. It's IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, generated material, and so it is completely uncontroversial. As much as climate movements and Extinction Rebellion and the rest of us climate activists might come across as extreme or controversial, the facts, the data that we base our opinions on are entirely mainstream. So that's the data. We'll look at that first. Then we look at, well, how did we get here? What are the reasons why we're in this situation, in this predicament? We'll look at the politics of it and the economics of it very, very briefly, followed by a theory of change. How do we expect to get out of this mess? As one of my favorite publicists, George Monbiot, and his book says, how do we get out of this mess that we've created for ourselves? And in the last section of the talk, we will be looking at Extinction Rebellion, what we do, who we are, what kind of, how do you join? I mean, you guys have all joined, so we don't need to talk that much about that, but what can you do within XR and how you might participate in the success of the movement. And on that point, I just want to say one little thing, and that is we need to act. As I said, I have a climate change degree, and at the point when I finished my degree and I'm looking at doing a PhD as well, I was thinking, well, do I need to do a PhD or do I need to take action? And it's clear that there's enough science now, and we have, for all intents and purposes, entered the age of consequences. And so action really is the key thing, and science is very important, and I'm very happy that other hundreds and thousands of climate scientists are working on it, but I feel like my place is in the action side of things. And that's because we no longer have an option for a non-radical future. Our future is going to be radical, whether we like it or not. There's no, the more things change, the more they stay the same. That saying is for the past. Things are changing now into an unrecognizable future. And what that radical means is where we need to take control. If we don't take control, it's going to look radically horrific. But if we do, we can build a radically better, a radically fair, and radically just society and world for ourselves, for our families, for our friends, for our neighbors, for the global community of humans alive on the planet today, as well as all the living creatures on the planet today, and for all the endless generations that are still to come. And that work has already started, and you guys are part of that work. I am inviting you to do more of that work. That's why we are here today. This talk used to be about informing. It is now much more about recruiting and mobilizing and galvanizing energy. So we will talk about the science in a minute, but I wanted to show you just one slide on what Extinction Rebellion is. I'm just going to continue to talk about XR for short. We are, and every single word matters here, we are a nonviolent, direct action, civil disobedience movement. We're not a company, we're not a charity, we're not even registered, we're a movement of individuals, everyday people. We're looking for a solution to these crises. And we have realized very importantly that individual action is not going to be sufficient to tackle these crises. And therefore, our job is to get our governments, our corporations and international organizations such as the United Nations, the European Union, etc., both here in the UK as well as everywhere else, to take decisive action on our behalf. Most emissions are emitted on our behalf, not by individuals, but by entities other than ourselves. And they must support and they must protect us. And the politicians who have pledged when they came into power to look after us, they need to look after our interests. And Extinction Rebellion exists to make sure that that happens. Especially the first part of this talk can generate feelings, quite a lot of feeling. It depends on the individual of what kind of feeling it generates. My personal feeling tends to be anger. I'm just so pissed off because we have known what's coming for decades, for probably about 40, 50 years we have known. And I'm angry because we haven't taken the action that needed to be taken then, or indeed at any point in time in the last 50 years. Other people experience shock or denial at the kind of information that you're about to see, or even numbness of what am I going to do? I'm helpless in this situation. But hopefully, and my job here in the first half of the talk is to get you into a sense of despair. That's where I'm going with this. I want you to despair because we're in a desperate situation. The second half of the talk is to provide you with potential ideas for how to feel relief, how to feel agency, how to feel hope. And when I joined Extinction Rebellion after having done my degree, and I was thinking, well, what do I do with this degree now? How do I sink my teeth into this problem? And XR came along, and it was such an eye-opener, and I suddenly felt agency. I felt like I'm in a group of like-minded people who are pulling in the same direction, and it feels great to be a part of that movement for that reason, if for no other reason, just to feel joined up with people who think and do the same things. It's quite therapeutic, actually. And that's it for a preamble. Let's go into the science. We have this one and only beautiful planet. We have the Earth. It's the only known place in the universe where we can exist. This is the planet we're going to be talking about today. It's a life support system for us humans and everything else that lives on the planet. You know, the air we breathe, the soil that we use, the water we drink, and everything else. It supports us. It's a complex system. You have probably seen these banners that say there is no planet B. Well, quite, there isn't. This is it. This system, if we destroy it, there will be nowhere else for us to go, in spite of what Elon Musk might say. Now, in the face of that, we are in a twin crisis. In fact, there are multiple crises, and we won't be able to touch on all of them in this talk. The two biggest ones are climate destruction and ecological destruction. There are others, plastic pollution, particulate pollution, ocean acidification, eutrophication. You could keep going, and each of those merits its own talk. But these two, if we don't fix these two twin crises, then all of the other work that we're doing on all the other crises will be for nothing, because these are what will make or break the Earth as a support system for humans. And the thing to stress is, we do not need to save the planet. We need to save people from the planet. The planet will be fine on a planetary scale, on a planetary time scale. It'll be absolutely fine. It's just that the people are going to go extinct if we keep doing what we're doing now. There needs to be radical change. It needs to happen now, because we are looking at a collapsing system. And I By personality, I'm such a little happy chappy. I'm a positive person by nature, by personality, but I am a data pessimist, because every time new data comes out from science, it is worse than the data that we had before. It seems that the climate is more sensitive to the warming that we're causing. It seems that there's more catastrophe on the way than we'd anticipated, and it's unsustainable. I want to show you the key graph for why this is the case. This is called the hockey stick graph, and it's been created by a team of people led by a paleoclimatologist called Michael Mann. It's called the hockey stick because of the back end of the graph, which I'm about to show you. This shows the global average carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in the last couple of thousand years. And what we can see on this part of this graph is that it's quite flat. It's around about 280 parts per million throughout this history, throughout these couple of thousand years. And in fact, if you look at this blip down here, when it goes from 280 to 270, just a dip of 10 parts per million in and around the 1600s, that caused a mini ice age in Europe, with lots of suffering, starvation, famine, and death as a result. So it's very sensitive, the climate, to changes in the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Now, as we advance towards the industrial age, we can see that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere rises exponentially and very rapidly. This is because as we start using coal and then later on oil and gas, we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere as we burn these fossil fuels. And so we are now, temporarily at least, at around about 424, 425 parts per million. The safe level is 350. So we're well beyond the safe level of CO2 already. And the other squiggly line that you see here on the right-hand side, the blue, is actual temperature measurements. We also have temperature reconstructions from ancient history, which are pretty good and very cool, and they go back millions of years. But this line here is actual measurements that have started at around about 1850 and become much more accurate with time. And we have millions of measurements a day now around the globe. And what we can see is that the red line of CO2 concentration is extremely tightly correlated with the blue squiggly line of temperature rise. And it appears to be the case that we're around about 1.1, 1.2 degrees of temperature increase, global average temperature, which varies a great deal around the planet. It is much lower on average over the seas, and it's higher over land. For example, in Europe right now, it's about 2.2 degrees above pre-industrial average temperatures. And in the Arctic and Antarctic, it goes up to about 5 degrees above already. So this is the squiggly line. This is the line we need to bear in mind. The red line, when we talk about net zero, the red line needs to be flat. Instead, it's going up exponentially year on year, in spite of everything that we're doing, and in spite of COVID, and in spite of all our personal efforts and everything else, which I will touch on a bit later. So whilst I wish these images that you see here would be something out of a science fiction movie or a catastrophe disaster movie, these are all the things that are already happening around the globe today. I'm going to close the window because it is raining quite hard here. So climate change is not into the distant future. Climate change is now. Climate change is everywhere around the globe, if you care to look. Climate scientists call this, well, we used to call it global warming, and then it was called climate change. Now it's called the climate emergency, and it's soon going to be called the climate catastrophe. But for now, the technical term is chaotic water regimes. And that's, in other words, too much water or not enough water. And in fact, both of those things can come right next to each other. So for example, a massive drought followed by a massive flood. And the four phenomena that you see here on the screen, droughts, wildfires, floods, and sea level rise, are the biggest ones, and extreme weather events that are being caused by climate change already now at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial average. I'm going to quote Antonio Guterres quite a lot He's the UN Secretary General. He is very much on board, and he is all of our daddies when it comes to climate change and many other issues besides. And he has some fantastic words to say, devastating words to say about climate change. About a year ago, he said that unchecked carbon pollution is forcing the world's most vulnerable on a frog march to destruction now. It's already happening now. And 1.1 might seem like a small amount, but it is already creating a lot of extra heat. So, for example, just to appreciate the difference between pre-industrial average and 1.1, if you imagine a Hiroshima bomb going off 5 times every second, something like this: boom, 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 boom. That's the speed at which, that's the additional heat that we're getting into the atmosphere every second, every hour, every single day of the year. That's how many calories of extra energy is being kept in by global warming around the planet. And it's unsurprising that the consequences are quite dire. It is already leading today to misery and destruction for millions of people. Billions of people are already exposed to extreme heat today. And right now, extreme weather is causing about 20 million people to move every year. Many of them want to return. Some of them can't. If you look down the bottom right-hand corner here, that's a place you might not be able to return to. And then, of course, you will have all heard of the unprecedented wildfire seasons around the globe, anywhere between Canada, Australia, Siberia, Europe, Greece, the list goes on. And it's happening today. Coastal flooding is happening to about 1 billion people today. Sea level rise is already putting cities at risk. The lowest lying cities, it's about 350 million people in Dhaka, in Bangladesh, Miami, New York City, Tokyo, Amsterdam. All of these places are very, very near sea level, and they will be very deeply affected. We're already now looking at complete loss of Arctic sea ice. It's inevitable, and it could be within the next 10 years. So there's just so much going on everywhere. I want to call your attention to 2 terminologies. One of them is mitigation, and the other one is adaptation. Mitigation is trying to slow down or stop climate change from occurring, and adaptation is when you acknowledge the change that has occurred and you're trying to make sure that you can live under the new regime or the new circumstances. When I started my studies, it was almost all about mitigation, trying to stop climate change from accelerating. And in the last 10 years, it really has changed into a lot of adaptive strategies, because mitigation is clearly failing. So we now know that we will have to adapt to these new circumstances. And I like to point out that it's not just on distant shores, it's also here in the UK. It is also already happening here. We are experiencing extreme heat, extreme wildfires, the most severe wildfire seasons we've ever experienced in the last couple of years, floods. About 1 in 6 people in England are at risk from flooding, from rivers and the sea, and also surface flooding more. Have you heard about the village of Fairborn? Anybody heard about Fairborn? So this, thank you, Denise. This village in Wales is a community which was, for reasons beyond my understanding, was built below sea level, and is now being forced to consider abandoning that village. They're still building sea defenses, but they won't be able to protect the village forever. And in the next couple of decades, they might well have to leave Fairborn and abandon that village, and other similar villages might have to follow. We are in this country looking at massive failures. I mean, you've seen water and what happens to the water companies, but failures of water, energy, and transport are all on the cards because of the changes that we're seeing, both in terms of temperatures, but also floods and droughts. And lastly, about the UK, we know that we import about 50% of our food. So food security in other countries will have a very direct consequence on us, both in terms of the availability of food as well as the price of food. We already know that, for example, today, of the inflation that we're experiencing, about 5% of the UK food price increase in the last year, 2022, was caused by reasons of climate change. So that's the climate in a nutshell, really whistle-stop tour. And let's have just 2 slides on the ecological crisis. Now, nature is not a nice to have. The well-being and the survival of human population, which is in fact growing quite rapidly, depends very critically on nature, on the food web, and that makes this planet habitable, and we are destroying it at an unprecedented rate. Not one single target for preserving nature has been met in the last decades. Everything is going south. Every indicator is going bad. The deforestation, every decade we have a lofty goal of completely stopping deforestation in the next 10 years. And then again, it's renewed for the next 10 years. Right now, we are on track to fail to stop deforestation by 2030. We are threatening about 1 million different species of plants and animals with extinction. And this is not what you would call the 6th extinction event, is what they used to call it, but I much prefer to call it an extermination event, because this is not a natural event. We are causing it, and we know we're doing it, and we are continuing to do it in spite of having this information. We have had very recently some fantastic progress on beautifully sounding and well-crafted agreements on nature protection, very similar to the Paris Agreement of 2015. Now, the Paris Agreement is being wholeheartedly ignored. So I'm not sure that I trust any other agreement to actually hold any water when it comes to defending nature. We are degrading the soil. We are converting biodiversity into animal farming mostly, and we are going to hit a brick wall when, for example, things like the Amazon rainforest collapses and gives way to savanna, and savanna gives way to desert. These are tipping points that do not reverse in the short term. They take thousands, potentially tens or hundreds of thousands of years to reverse. So once it's tipped over, there's no going back. What we've done is we've changed the face of the planet. We have deforested and desertified our planet to make way for animal agriculture. About 20% of our calories come from animal products, but about 80% of the land that we have converted to agriculture goes to animal agriculture. And most of that is not the grazing grounds, it is the feed crops that feed the animals that we then eat. The biggest, by far the biggest culprit is beef. Extinction Rebellion does not advocate for any particular lifestyle or any particular solution. But if you're looking at your own personal fingerprint, carbon footprint, then eating beef is the single biggest one in your diet by a long margin. And cutting out beef, or cutting out 90% of the beef that we eat, would take us a very long way towards rewilding the planet, which is desperately needed. Now, I have a slide which I usually use for showing some of the most recent things that are going on, some data, some news, and they're never good. The news is never good. There's always some kind of wildfire, there's always some kind of flood, there's always crop failure, famines, and desperate people fleeing places. July 2023 was the hottest week on record on the planet, and the last time that the Earth was this warm was 120,000 years ago in the interglacial period. So us as humans, as a human civilized society, we've never experienced this heat before. Again, this year in June 2023, the smoke that arose from the Canadian wildfires temporarily made New York City, the most polluted city in the world, major impacts on human health. That very same smoke also reached Europe, Scandinavia, and the rest of Europe later on. So we cannot expect these local extreme weather events to stay local in their impacts, whether or not the impact is smoke or people fleeing desperate situations. These weather events are coming for us, and nobody currently in power is actually coming to or even promising to save us. At the same time, the International Energy Agency reports that the support for fossil fuel is doubled between 2021 and 2022. We're producing more and more of the stuff, and none of the new fossil fuels, as we know, is consistent with staying below 1.5 degrees of warming. And it is in this context that this year's climate summit, COP28, is happening. It's happening in the United Arab Emirates, major oil producer, and it will be chaired by a guy called Sultan Al Jaber. He's the head of the state oil company of UAE. And it's kind of ironic because the biggest thing that none of the COPs have ever achieved so far is to say the words stop oil or stop gas or phase out fossil fuels. These 27 conferences of the parties has been insufficient for any resolution to come out that utters the word oil. Now, how likely is that Sultan Al Jaber, and under his auspices, this is the year where phasing out of oil is going to be finally announced? It seems very unlikely. So that's the news today. Let's have a look at the next years. So in this next, well, I should probably say 17 years because I want us to get to 2040. So Paris Agreement wants us to stay below 1.5 as a safe upper limit. And remember, we are already at 2.2 in Europe today, and it's 1.1 globally. So we are very likely to go over 1.5 as early as 2026, at least temporarily for a single year. It might go dip slightly below that afterwards, but we are kind of there within the next few years. And if you look at climate modeling, which has become an extremely complicated and sophisticated science to look at what climate is going to do dependent on what we do and how sensitive it is to our actions, there is no credible model which says that we do not crash right through the 1.5 barrier. All the models say if we want 1.5, we're going to have to come back down to it using fairy tale techniques such as carbon capture and storage and negative emissions, which no one's ever been able to achieve. So that's within the next potentially even 10 years, we will be getting crashing through the 1.5 degree barrier. And that means that we now have to prepare. This is the adaptation I've been talking about. We have to prepare for more heat, more flooding, more wildfires, more storms, crop failures, collapsing fish stocks, more hunger, and more displacement of people. And we must accept that we might be the very last generation who gets to see the Amazon rainforest as a rainforest. We might conceivably crash through 2 degrees by 2034. And that is the final frontier for catastrophe. If we go beyond 2040, let's just stop and think about 2040. How old are we going to be in just 17 years' time? We will hopefully be all still around. Certainly our loved ones will be around, our children and others will certainly be around. And we will have gone past 2 degrees of heating at that point. And large parts of the world will become uninhabitable because of the extreme heat and the droughts, and then sudden flooding as well. These changes become more and more irreversible. Tipping points are being reached. So tipping points such as the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the sudden thawing of the permafrost, releasing untold billions of tons of methane, which is one of the most powerful greenhouse gases on the short term, at least. And it looks like it might be game over for trying to retain some degree of control over the climate at that point. This point is not far away. And the thing is, leaders, they know this. They have been warned time and time again. And it's just that they're not taking action to protect us. Now, almost all the models and all the talk, the discourse goes up to the year 2100. I personally, I don't like that because I don't think history finishes in 2100. I think history carries on. By 2100, depending on what we do, 4 degrees of warming is quite possible. Climate scientist Professor Kevin Anderson says, a 4 degrees Celsius future is incompatible with an organized global community. It is likely to be beyond adaptation and is devastating to the majority of ecosystems. So by the end of the century, I don't know if I get to see it. I suspect I might, unless we all kill each other before then. I'd like to. I'd like to see it, even if it looks like this. But by that point, the majority of Earth's population will be exposed to deadly heat every year, a near certainty of catastrophic crop failures every year, water shortage for up to a third of every human every year, hundreds of millions of people exposing to high flood risk every year. And the nature on the planet is challenged beyond its evolutionary capacity, leading to catastrophic mass extinction. It is inconceivable that most of humanity can adapt to this level of warming. We will have patches of humanity left at this point if we continue on this path that we are on right now. And any chance at that point of a better future for most of humanity will be lost and lost forever. And we're going to stop there. I'm going to stop the recording for a second. So here we are. We've had some time for reflection. Let's move on to the second half of the talk, which is about how we got here and how we get out of this mess. And the first point to make, and which I have already made to some degree previously, is that nothing so far has worked. What I'm about to show you the hockey stick graph on which we can plot all the things that we've tried to do in the last 40 or 50 years since we've known. You know, Greenpeace is 50 plus years old. The IPCC was formed in 1988. We had the UK Climate Change Act 2008 and Copenhagen Accords 2009. The Kyoto Protocol 1997, Paris Agreement 2015. We had 27 conferences of the parties, and yet the curve goes up like this. The curve needs to be flat, and in fact, the curve needs to start going downwards. There's no reason for us to believe that that's going to happen anytime soon. There have been so many politicians, so many meetings, so many conferences, so many legal cases, so many years of environmental campaigning, and none of that has worked, including all the windmills and all the solar panels and all the personal commitments that we've made throughout these last decades. That's all of that stuff put together have got us into this position. Since the formation of the IPCC in 1988, we have emitted more CO2 knowingly than in all of our emissions previously in history. So it's clear that nothing has actually worked so far. And the interesting thing is that now, today, in 2023, it is very common and it's very well known. So everybody in power, everybody who is in positions of influence, they pay lip service to climate change. There's very few proper climate deniers anymore. Most of them say, yes, we know, and yes, we want to sort it out. They just don't actually do anything meaningful about it. The politicians know. The military, they talk about a national security issue when they talk about climate change. Scientists have been banging the drums for 50 years. Oh, and my favorite, the oil companies, of course, they have all the secret records from the 1980s, which are uncannily accurate, actually. They knew back then very precisely what was going on. The science was pretty good. And the people to watch are the insurance companies, because they have actually got a whole separate department just for risk management, because that is the nature of their business. If they don't manage their risks properly, then they will go out of business. So it is their business to know what kind of risks exist. Recently, insurance companies have said we're not going to insure the newly built homes in Northern California because of all the wildfires that are happening there. It just doesn't make any sense. If the insurance companies are leaving, you know that there is problems. If I go back to COP26, I was physically there in Glasgow in 2021. We hosted this conference. All the favorite people came. This is Boris and Joe. They made a lot of positive noise. And then they went home and they continued to issue drilling licenses, more drilling licenses. In fact, Joe Biden issued more drilling licenses than Donald Trump did, whilst they know that any new fossil fuel infrastructure is incompatible with 1.5 degrees, to which they claim that they are well committed. In fact, if you look around the globe for all the governments and what they're planning to do, they're planning for more emissions by 2030, about 16% more is the plan, as opposed to reducing. We need to reduce about 10% year on year. The year of COVID, 2020, did not produce that level of reduction. It was 6 or 7% reduction, which means that 93% of the CO2 emissions were still being pumped into the atmosphere, even in that year where all the flights were down, where all the cars were parked, and everything was put on hold for pretty much the whole year. And what is also happening now is we are chucking good money after bad. Is that the expression, or the other way around? Good money after bad. Thank you. We are making these pledges to net zero, but we are actually funding, with our taxpayers' money, we're subsidizing the fossil fuel industry like crazy. We're giving the fossil fuel industry globally, as global citizens, about $10 million every single minute. And to dramatize that a little bit, that's about $170,000 per second, every second. By the time I finish this sentence, we will have given our money, $500,000 million of our money, to fossil fuel giants to create more climate destruction from the money that we've given them. It's just incredible. It's our money. They're spending our money on killing us. It's crazy. So there's only a couple of slides in this whole deck of about 50 slides that I really, really want you to take home with you. This is one of them. This is one of the most important points. I just want to talk you through what these numbers mean. So 0 degrees is the pre-industrial average, global average temperature. And then we hear a lot about 1.5 and keeping 1.5 degrees alive, and that it's on life support. These are the kinds of expressions that they're saying. That is a whole load of bullshit. Anybody who says 1.5 is alive is lying to you, whoever it is, whether there's a sympathetic character or not. What actually is happening is the global governments are making us promises, pledges for net zero by 2050. They sell this to us as, quote unquote, the solution, right? Now, net zero by 2050, and that's the target, that's what we're aiming for, would put us at about 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial average. And we've already established that anything above 2 degrees is an unmitigated disaster. So what they're promising to us as a solution is actually a disaster. But actually, we know that they're very bad. They have a terrible record of keeping their promises. So on track of what current policies actually do, we're going to look at somewhere between that 2.4 and 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. We don't know for sure. There's a lot of uncertainty, but this is what we're doing. This is what they're promising to do, and this is what they're saying that we're doing. And so if you remember that anybody who talks to you about net zero by 2050 and selling that as a solution is pulling the wool over your eyes, then I will have not lived for nothing. And so it is the case that business as usual is just not an option. The warming of the planet is only going to halt or stop when we stop emitting carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalents, methane being one big one. And this system that we're in, it doesn't know how to do that. It's not even slowing down CO2 emissions. Tinkering around the edges is not going to be sufficient. Only complete and structural change will work. People often say, well, if everybody did a little bit, then that would go a long way. But actually, the opposite is true. If everybody did a little bit, that would amount to an overall insignificant change. And in fact, everybody needs to do everything. As we've said, no new fossil fuel infrastructure project is compatible with 1.5. Most fossil fuels, even the existing ones that we know about without even any new extraction, need to stay in the ground. I'd like you to imagine for a second, just for this country, for the UK, what net zero might look like. So we would have to decommission every internal combustion engine. All the cars, all the lorries, all the diesel trains, everything would have to go. We would have to insulate every last house. We have the worst insulated housing stock in the whole of Europe. We'd have to insulate and retrofit every single house. We would have to take away every single gas boiler and other fossil fuel boilers and replace them with an electric one. It was for a short while, it seemed like we might be going towards hydrogen, proving to be a non-starter. So it is going to be heat pumps, every single household. We would have to completely overhaul the electric grid because we'd be looking at a lot more electricity consumption. We would have to change the electricity mix. Right now, about 40% is still gas in the UK. Somewhere between 0 to 5%, depending on the day, is coal. And so all of that would have to be replaced by renewable energy sources, mainly onshore wind and solar. Just Scotland alone has twice as much potential for onshore wind than what is needed for the entire UK. There are challenges for transportation of the energy, so it doesn't typically like to travel more than a couple of 100 miles. So that's not really proposed as a solution. But what I'm saying is the resources are available to us today. And instead, of course, we're going to go and drill some more oil in the North Sea. So if you imagine that level of change, of everything changing, transportation is a big one. You'd have to replace journeys. So the car journeys would have to be replaced by what? First of all, with no journey. Let's not travel if we don't need to. Secondly, if we have to travel, let's walk. If we cannot walk, let's cycle or scooter. If we cannot do that, then we should be using a zero fossil fuel public transportation option, or low fossil fuel anyway. And only as a last resort, use an electric car. And I'm not here to propagate electric cars. They have their problems of their own. And I would call them a last resort technology, even though I do also drive one as a last resort. But all of those other things come first. And it is a complete change of a system, and it's a complete change of mindsets and mentalities across the whole country. And that needs to happen globally. So you can see the scale of the challenge. And when Extinction Rebellion says we need to do all this by 2025, you can see how that is an impossible demand. And yet that's what we demand, because we don't go on what is possible, we go on what is necessary. And net zero by 2025 happens to be the only target for the UK specifically that is compatible with 1.5 degrees. And I heard you say earlier today that you feel shame, and I don't want you to feel shame. I want you to remember that it is not your fault. You are living in a faulty system. You're being given extremely poor choices. You can choose between a very expensive electric car, for example, or a very cheap diesel car. How are you going to make that choice? And that's just one small example. You could go the same way with plastic. If you go back 30, 40 years, nothing was wrapped in plastic. Now everything is wrapped in plastic. How are you going to live plastic free? You can't. But it's not because it's not possible, but it's because these are the choices that we're being given. And even the idea of a carbon footprint, I'm interested to see if you could put your hands up in the air, if you've ever thought about or tried to do or kept track of your carbon footprint. Has anybody done that? Most of us, many of us. Or at least you're aware of the fact that you have a carbon footprint and you're trying to lower it. Well, that was something that was propagated by the guys who gave us the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, BP, the visual that you see here on this picture. And together with a PR giant called Ogilvy. they have worked for decades to obscure the link between fossil fuel giants and CO2 emissions, and they've tried to put the onus on us. Now, the important thing to remember here, and this is a mini lesson in economics, is the supply side versus the demand side. We, the people who consume these fossil fuel products, we're the demand side. And the people who bring up fossil fuels from the ground, they're the supply side. Now, you can play around with the demand side by saying we need to consume less of this resource, less of this stuff, replace our cars, replace our boilers, put the solar panels on the roof, blah, 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 blah. And so demand comes down locally, right? But if on the supply side, they continue to extract oil, for example, then at some point, at some price, in some geographical area, that oil will get used. So the point I'm making is the only way to reduce the usage of oil is not on the demand side, it's on the supply side. And if I'm sitting on top of 1 trillion barrels of oil, I'm not going to stop extracting them. The only reason I would stop doing so is because a government outlaws it. So we need governments to take legislative action on phasing out fossil fuels. And that is what Extinction Rebellion is here to do, to force the government to take that action to reduce the supply side of fossil fuels. Does that make sense? That's what we're trying to do. But the question still remains of how did we get here? Because if we know how we got here, maybe we can figure out how to get out of here. And there are 3 things that I want to mention here. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I'm conscious of my time. So electoral democracy or representative democracy, as they like to falsely call it, where you replace your leaderships or your governing party every 4 or 5 years, is very unconducive to long-term planning. Any elected politician finds it very difficult to think 10, 20, or 100 years into the future. It's not entirely their fault. It is the way in which the system works. And so they always end up kicking the can down the road because they cannot think beyond 4 years, usually not even 5 minutes. They will never get elected on a manifesto of inconvenience. So if I stand up and say, guys, we have 20 rough years ahead of us while we phase out these fossil fuels, it's going to be a tough 20 years for you, for everybody, but we're going to get through it. I'm just not going to get elected on that platform. So that's the first reason. The second reason is the way in which economies and neoliberal economics, as you mentioned, works. This idea that growth is valued above everything. There's an assumption here. And the assumption is that the environment is an endless free source of raw materials, such as clean water, clean air, fertile soil, fossil fuels. And it is also at the same time, on the other end, an endless sink where you can dispose of any kind of waste and pollution. It assumes that these resources are free forever and that producing waste has no consequences forever. But we already know that we're currently, even now, using 1 3/4 of the planets, which means it's unsustainable. We only have this one planet, and that will inevitably lead to collapse. The visual you see here, by the way, is the Ogoni land oil spill and the Niger River Delta in Nigeria. Was done by Royal Dutch Shell. 11 years ago, they got ordered. The Ogoni people were awarded about $1 billion worth of damages, and the company Shell was ordered to clean up. 11 years on, it looks exactly the same, and they never paid the money. They're getting away with it. So it seems that killing and destroying the land of hundreds of thousands of people for profit, the profit's more important. And lastly, the connection between the two. So we've had the politicians on the one hand, we've had the vested interest on the other hand of money. And just as an example, the top 5 oil companies spend about $200 million dollars every single year just to lobby for a delay in carbon reduction. If you want to contrast that with something, think about Extinction Rebellion's budget, which is about 1 million pounds a year. So they're outspending us by 2 orders of magnitude times 2. And in a way, it's surprising that we're getting any traction at all. And of course, they're also being supported by their friends, the billionaire press barons, who are spouting out the nonsense about both us and about the environment on a daily basis. And I'm not one of those people who like to point at the elites. I find it, generally speaking, a lazy argument. But you have to wonder who is responsible for all of this. And it won't surprise you that it is the people in power. When I say people in power, think about people like financial power, governmental power, very super highly concentrated. So it's not the 1%, it's the 0.01%. And us, the rest of us, the 99.99% suffer the consequences. And it is our job to ensure that we get justice, all sorts of justice, environmental justice, climate justice, racial justice, health justice. We need to redistribute power to the 99.99% in a much more equitable way and take that power away from global corporations, the mega rich, think tanks, financial institutions, and political parties. These people, this 0.01%, they don't need us. They really don't care whether we come or go, whether we're here or where we're not. They don't care about the inequality across the globe. And I want to show you that inequality in a little bit more visual way. So this is historical CO2 emissions globally, and the bigger the bubble, the more the historical emissions. So that's disproportionate. You can see that Europe, and within that the UK specifically, is quite high. That's because of our historic emissions from the industrial age onwards in coal. And then of course the US is huge, and Southeast Asia, China is coming up the curve. Japan is quite big as well. But on the other hand, we can see that Africa and South America are quite small when it comes to their overall contributions to the CO2 in the atmosphere today. Contrast that to the impacts of climate change on people around the globe today and into the future. And now we can see that Africa, which was quite anemic in the causing of climate change, is disproportionately being affected. And so is Southeast Asia. And that the biggest climate culprits of Europe and the US are barely affected at all. And these two charts put together, they can start to explain to you why there is so little action being taken, because the consequences are not being seen in the places where the causes are generated, if that makes sense. The next thing I want to tell you is I'd like you to remember 3 words. So what is the one thing we have to do? And I've touched on this, and which is why Extinction Rebellion is here. I'm a CO2 purist, because if we don't deal with CO2, then everything else we will have done will not matter. We will fail if the CO2 problem doesn't go away. So we need to stop fossil fuels from being extracted, especially, but also used. And we need to do this rapidly, entirely, and forever. These are the 3 words I want you to remember: rapidly, entirely, and forever. Personal action and personal lifestyle changes are great because they model the world in which we want to live, but they will by themselves fail. It is critical that we approach this from the perspective of governments, international organizations, corporations. They need to change, and we, XR, need to make them change. And believe me, it is possible. Let's be clear, net zero can be done. And we also know that it wants to be done. The United Nations has conducted a survey, and they can see that the vast majority of people, more than 2/3 of us around the globe, believe that there's a climate emergency. It's a global emergency, and they want to see change. So there is will to do it. We just need people in power to take action on our behalf. Now, this is a mural which was painted by an activist called Jane Mutiny. And it says it's not too late to act now. I would like to modify that very slightly. I'd say it is too late to avoid a disaster. As I've said, there's no non-radical future in store for us. What we do still have a narrow window of opportunity for is to make a choice of what kind of disaster we want. We can have an unmitigated disaster, or we can have a manageable disaster. Those are the two kinds of disasters we can have, and there's no other option on the table. And we come to Extinction Rebellion. We are XR. We are here. We are together, and we're here to save the world. It's a hard one because, interestingly, I've been here for 4 years now, and at first I embraced that, and I thought, oh my God, great, this is the movement that's going to save the world. And then I thought, oh my God, that's a lot of expectation. And people around me just said, well, first of all, we need to be perfect, and second of all, we need to do the work. And there's certainly a lot of us, but there's definitely not enough of us to be able to save the world in its current form. We have a plan, we have a strategy, we know what we're trying to do here. We do not know if we will succeed, but that would be a really terrible reason not to try anyway. We do not have choices anymore. We have to rebel because all the other things that we've been talking about before have failed. And XR is a large global organization. We have in excess of 1,000 local groups in 86 countries. That data is very fresh. There are over 400 groups in the UK alone. Every town and city has an Extinction Rebellion chapter. There is one near to you. We are big, but we are by far not big enough. I don't know if you're familiar with Erica Chenoweth's work, which is controversial in some circles, but there is a basic tenet, which is, critical mass is required for change. Now, how big is that critical mass? Does the entire population have to agree? No. Does half of the population have to agree? No. Erica finds that about 3.5% of the population can make a radical change in a society. For the UK alone, that's a couple of million people. And if you think the fact that we had 100,000 people out in the streets for the big one in April 2023, we are 5% of the way there. Yeah. So whilst we're big, we're by far not big enough. Importantly, we have demands. One of the things that I find in other social movements, for example, the Occupy movement 2010, they were very sympathetic. They were very disappointed, disillusioned, but they didn't really know what they wanted. They didn't want what we had. The system was broken, and they recognized that very well. But what instead should we have was unclear. So Extinction Rebellion has these 3 very clear demands. They have been almost exactly the same since their inception. They change some of the words, sometimes change, but the key tenets are the same. The first one, tell the truth. Everybody needs to tell the truth. Politicians, media, corporations, everybody needs to be able to say the kind of predicament we find ourselves in and be clear about that. The fact that we're still having these talks today and that I'm encouraging you to find more people to tell these things to means that we haven't been told the truth, and certainly not to the sufficient degree. If I think back to the pandemic, COVID was front page every day for a couple of years, all the time. That's the level of coverage that is required for climate change as well. More people are being killed by climate change on the day-to-day basis than COVID ever did. So the truth needs to come out. The second point, which I've already mentioned, net zero by 2025. It is impossible, but it is the only one that's consistent with 1.5. And lastly, citizens' assemblies to decide together. And this is, we talked about the fact that representative democracy is failing us. We needed an additional layer of democracy, of direct democracy, whereby a citizens' assembly can provide us with guidance on what we need to do, which governments will then be legally obliged to follow. This is a tried and tested method. I won't go into the detail of it. Extinction Rebellion is huge on citizens' assemblies. So read up on that. There's a whole section of people who are all about citizens' assemblies, and I recommend them wholeheartedly. How it works and why it works, but it does work. In fact, we had a citizens' assembly in the UK in 2021, which reported back in 2022, but there was no legal teeth, so the government wasn't obliged to actually take any action on the recommendations of that citizens' assembly, and sure enough, it didn't. It was very easy to ignore. So those are our three core demands, which have been supplemented for this year by an immediate demand, which is to end all new fossil fuels. So no more fossil fuel subsidies. We have to stop propping up these industries. No more fossil fuel extraction licenses, because we cannot open up more fossil fuels. We need to be stopping these infrastructures, not add to them. And so no more fuel extraction licenses, and also no new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to start moving away from the fossil fuel economy now. I'm seeing some comments coming in on the chat. I will address them at the end. I'm almost there. By the way, we're at 8:30. How do you guys feel about staying on here for another 15 minutes or so? Thank you. That's very good. I promise to be quite quick. So having done everything else, we now need to recognize that rebellion is our only last option. We know that the scale of the challenge is huge. How do we do that? That's what I'm going to talk about in a second. But one key point here is, if we're not going to do it now, then who's going to do it and when? It really is up to us, up to all of us. And once your eyes are open, they don't close again. This is it. You're in it now. Yeah, we know we're heading towards the cliff edge. We understand the risks. We understand the moral imperative to take action. We have a duty here. And, you know, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon until the job is done. And I feel like a lot of people in XR, even though it's hard work, and even though it sometimes feels impossible, that's just you're trapped by your own moral obligation towards the whole of the planet and everything else. So you want to know that we can succeed, because otherwise it would be a hopeless exercise and very depressing. It is important to remember that nonviolent direct action, for which Extinction Rebellion is so well known, is we're joining here a great tradition, a whole bunch of other movements that have come together and have achieved fantastic things in the past. If I just think about some of these movements, India's independence movement, women's suffrage, the abolition movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-apartheid movement, the LGBTQ movement, all of these movements, and they have a couple of things in common. The first thing in common about them is that they were met with a great deal of resistance from governments at the time. They were considered criminal at the time, and yet they succeeded, and yet we now look at them as heroes of their own historic times and periods. I mean, who would dispute right now that women ought to have the vote, or who would dispute right now that apartheid was a bad thing? You might say that the civil rights movement is a half-finished effort if you look at what's going on in the US, but they're certainly in a different place than they were 50 years ago. And so the other critical commonality between these movements is that they were seeking this tipping point where the change that they were looking for not only became possible, but it became inevitable. And so Extinction Rebellion is doing exactly that same thing. And what's interesting about that is, until that moment comes, you don't know that it is ever going to come. I grew up in communist Hungary, and we thought we were going to have communism forever, that was it. It was entrenched and it was immovable. And all of a sudden, without the firing of a single bullet in 1989, it just went. It fizzled out of existence, as if it never was there. It was the strangest sensation, but this is the kind of tipping point that I'm talking about, and it is possible. So how do we do that? How do we build a movement that can succeed? There's two major points to this. The first one is nonviolence. So nonviolence has historically been shown to be effective. It is more effective than a violent revolution. So therefore, it is the practical thing to do. It is also the ethical thing to do. We are, all of us, nonviolent people. We're not here to cause a ruckus. In fact, we're trying to save the planet, not the other way around. And nonviolence is also practical because it enables more people to join. So we've got a larger movement. It's an easier to join movement. Also, if it's a larger movement, it will have more skills. And as you will see in a second, a movement like ours requires a lot of different, a range of different skills. And also, once you have a larger movement, it starts to look like a broader section of society, and people looking upon a movement might more conceivably see people that look like them, also see family members and friends joining that movement, and it's a snowball effect. So the larger the movement is, the larger the movement can become, and the bigger the movement is, we know that it becomes more effective at exerting pressure on governments. Now, we are also not just large and nonviolent, but we are also in the business of creating disruption. Disruption has a few reasons why you need to do them. And if you go back again to the women's suffrage movement, they did break rather a lot of windows, and they did set a few houses on fire as well. I want you to distinguish in your mind violence from property damage. Violence is perpetrated against living things, creatures, humans, and otherwise, and property damage, when done correctly, does not endanger any individual human as well-being or life. Extinction Rebellion has been known to very gently and very carefully break some windows, much more carefully than the suffragettes did back in the day. But we are here to create disruption. We are here to both to create publicity that is coming from disruption, but also to stop the regime from doing what they're doing. I'll come to this in a second, but we did have the big one, which was imagined as a non-disruptive protest. It is so easily ignored. You disrupt something and immediately the press is on top of it. It's newsworthy, it's fun, it's crazy. And so they report on it. 60,000 people showing up in front of Parliament building, not reportable. So disruption is creating pressure. Now, of course, we as law-abiding citizens, we all want to obey the law. I'm like that too. I don't want to disobey the law. I don't want to end up in prison. I don't want to get talked to by police at all. But we have to disrupt, and as Martin Luther King said, disobeying unjust laws is the highest form of it's the highest form of morality. I think, I'm not sure what the words were that he used. This is an incorrect quote, but disobeying unjust laws is the right way forward. Quietly offering leaflets and signing petitions and sending messages to your MP have clearly failed. We need to put ourselves in other people's way. Now, what's happened in the last 4 years is we've put ourselves in front of the everyday person, and that has helped us to raise a lot of awareness. 75% of all UK councils have now declared a climate emergency on the basis of the work that we've done. The UK Parliament has declared a climate emergency. We have had court trials where we're acquitted by juries that realized and understood the platform on which we've done what we've done. And even though we had no standing in the law, we were still acquitted. However, in these 4 years, we've created a lot of disruption of people, and we've changed the strategy this year. We've said, okay, we think that there is enough awareness now. We can stop doing disruption of the everyday public. Let's disrupt instead seats of power. And we did that. We went to Parliament in large numbers, and we were joined by over 200 different organizations, such as these ones here. It's a pretty impressive list. You know, some of the more predictable ones: Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and you know, Climate Change Network and Dolphin Conservation, that sort of stuff. But we also had other less obvious organizations join forces with us: Association of Clinical Psychologists, Global Women's Strike, Women of Color Global Strike, Queer Strike, Black Lives Matter, you know, nanas for, what's the word? Anti-fracking nanas, that's right, anti-fracking nanas, which is, by the way, a fantastic example of non-violent direct action, which has stopped fracking in the UK completely by local activist groups who just camped out for a couple of years in front of these fracking sites. And sure enough, there's a fracking moratorium in place. It just doesn't seem to work in this country. It's not wanted. But anyway, we got together for the big one with these with our partners, and we got very thoroughly ignored. So what are we going to do next? For the next phase, we are looking to do three things. And this is, by the way, this is all on the strategy. It's on the XR website as well. The three things that we want to do is picket, organize locally, and to continue to disobey. And picketing is an important aspect of joining forces with other organizations, other like-minded people who eventually ultimately want the same thing, which is a better world for all of us, more justice. Cost of living, decent pay, and working conditions are the same exact fight. It's the same fight for justice. And so we're joining hands with people around the country and around the world. The second point is about organizing locally. And when you look at this picture, you might consider this the dullest possible picture ever, because it is people with bald heads or gray heads voting on local matters that matter very little anywhere outside of that constituency. And it's not what you would call classical activism, but sitting in these council meetings, having a voice at these meetings locally. If every single meeting, every single locality had a climate activist voice heard in that room, it would make such a major difference. It is critical, but it's only critically effective if it is happening around the country and around the world. I do have a personal example. I live near Southampton. We have Southampton Airport here, and they're looking to extend the runway so that they can land larger jets, leading to more pollution, leading to more noise, leading to a few more jobs as well. But basically, we are in a time when we should be decommissioning airports or reducing airports, not expanding them. And we fought tooth and nail to stop the expansion of the airport to no effectiveness at all. However, standing in the way of that runway extension is a copse of trees. And the planning permission to cut down those trees is one that we have fought very effectively so far. So whatever, it's just a line of trees. And if you can protect the trees, then you're stopping the building works, or you're delaying them, you're making it more likely that it never gets built. It's the same thing that's happening around Heathrow Runway 3. So I would hope and wish that every town and council would have that kind of obstructionist, activist voice present in the room at all times. If you wonder what kind of actions can you take, go see these, go get involved in local councils. It is very important. And lastly, we have been disobeying since October 2018. We sometimes feel a bit alone doing so. But what we're also finding is, my printer suddenly wants to do things. That wasn't me. So yeah, so we have felt alone sometimes, although we are now, I think, not alone at all. Both from the more activist perspective, Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain, but also people who are now finding their voice for the first time and beginning to exercise their rights to civil disobedience. It is our job to help them. It's our job to join them because we have experience. We can strengthen their cases, and together we are stronger. And ultimately, we do want the same thing. So the next slide I don't need to present to you because you guys are all activists, and I don't need you to join. So I'm going to go straight to the fact that whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever interests you, there is a place for you in XR. There's just so many different interest groups. XR is organized, as you know, along a few different cross-cutting parameters. So there's localities, a geographical organization, there's interests, and there's activism bubbles. So for example, I'm in the talks and trainings bubble. There's regenerative cultures, there's gardeners, as you have said. There's all sorts of roles, but there's also interest groups. So whoever you are, there will be some place for you where you feel you meet with like-minded people. And also whatever kind of skills you can bring to the table, there will be a task for you. I didn't do the tallying, but I think there's about 200 different roles within Extinction Rebellion. So everybody in this room will have some kind of a skill or talent or experience that you can bring to bear at XR. And we need every bit of everybody. And it doesn't matter how much time you've got. We will take that. If you have an hour a week, we'll take that. If you want to work full-time for Extinction Rebellion, we will take that too. The one thing we don't want is for people to not get active. I'm going to finish us today with this little poster, which I found and I find quite compelling. Don't let this be you, and don't let this be your friends either. Our last slide is just an information slide, and you're welcome to take a picture of this if you want to, but it's all on the XR UK website anyway, and you guys have been signed up, so you don't particularly need this information, but I'm showing it for those of you who may be watching this video at a later date. My sign-off line is two things. Number one, do not believe for a second that if you've made your personal lifestyle changes and commitments, that you can sit back and relax. Forcing government action is necessary. Personal lifestyle changes are necessary for modeling the future world that we want to live in, but by themselves, they will not take us far enough. And number two, do not believe for a second that XR have got your back. We haven't got your back. You cannot just sit back and relax because we're acting on your behalf. We need more people, a lot more people. We need you. The planet needs you, and life itself needs you.